This is what happens when a nurse forgets her place and countermands a physician's DNR recommendation. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before the 4-star general's heart stopped for the 3rd time in 6 days. Seattle General's ICU smells like bleach and fear at 0600, fluorescent lights buzzing over 12 beds where the sickest patients in the Pacific Northwest cling to life by the thinnest thread. The ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm, a sound like something drowning on dry land. Katie Morrison checks the general's vitals with steady hands that don't shake, hands that have held worse things than a failing heart monitor. Her slight limp is barely noticeable as she moves between bed 4 and the rolling crash cart, a limp she acquired 17 years ago in a place that no longer exists on any map. She's been a nurse at Seattle General for 6 years now, quiet, competent, the one who takes the hardest assignments without complaint, the one who stays late without being asked, the one nobody really knows. The scars on her forearms, visible when she reaches for 4 bags or adjusts the bear hugger warming blanket, look like shrapnel patterns, which is exactly what they are. When the general's oxygen saturation drops to 87% during the night shift, Katie adjusts his ventilator settings with the precision of someone who's done this in worse conditions, in places where the electricity ran on generators and the sterile field was whatever sand you could brush away. Her fingers move with the terrifying fluid precision of someone trained in tactical medicine, muscle memory encoded in bone and blood. Nobody notices. Nobody asks. That's the point. The general arrived at Seattle General 4 weeks ago, transferred from Walter Reed after his cardiothoracic team deemed him a terminal admission, a medical euphemism for let him die. 73 years old, post-operative from a classified surgical procedure that nobody was allowed to discuss, his heart was failing in a way the textbooks called irreversible. His ejection fraction was 18%. His kidneys were shutting down. 3 senior cardiologists had written the same note in his chart: comfort measures only, DNR in place, prognosis measured in days. They were wrong. Katie knew they were wrong the moment she read his chart, and knowing they were wrong became the most dangerous thing about her entire life at Seattle General. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket is tarnished silver, the kind of tarnish that comes from 20 years of being carried in a combat pocket, through dust storms and helicopter landings, and one very specific moment in a collapsed schoolhouse in Marja where a 6-year-old boy was pinned under concrete and rebar. She turns it over with her thumb during her breaks, a habit that calms her the way other people's hands might shake. The texture is rough from handling, the inscription worn smooth, the design barely visible anymore, but she knows every millimeter of it. She knows who gave it to her. She knows when. She knows why. And she knows that the man in bed for is that same boy, except now he's 73 and his name is plastered on a hospital chart and his heart is betraying him the way everything betrays soldiers who survive long enough. Dr. Whitfield enters the ICU at 0647, before the morning briefing, before the shift change, before the hospital starts to wake up in earnest. He's carrying Katie's patient chart the way a prosecutor carries evidence. He doesn't look at her. That's the first sign that something has shifted. He moves straight to the nursing station where 3 residents are reviewing overnight labs, and his voice, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and heavy with threatened authority, makes all 3 of them straighten. "I need everyone in the conference room," he says. "Grand rounds. Now." The conference room on the 4th floor holds 40 people at capacity. This morning it holds 30 residents, 5 attending physicians, 2 nurses who aren't Katie, and Katie standing at the back of the room with her hands clasped in front of her like a supplicant. The fluorescent lights hum their institutional drone. The rain outside the windows hammers Seattle like applause for something nobody wanted. Dr. Whitfield stands at the front with a projector remote in one hand and Katie's patient chart in the other, and the way he holds that chart, like it's poisoned, tells her everything she needs to know about what the next 30 minutes will look like. "This patient," Dr. Whitfield says, and the projector flickers to life behind him showing the general's EKG from 3 days ago, is a 73-year-old male admitted with acute decompensated heart failure, ejection fraction of 18%, and a DNR order signed by himself and 3 consulting physicians. He turns a page in the chart. The sound is sharp, like a gunshot in the silence. His orders were clear. Comfort care. Do not resuscitate. Allow natural death. He pauses. He looks at the residents. And this is what happens when a nurse forgets her place and countermands a physician's DNR recommendation. Katie's jaw tightens, but her eyes stay forward. Not on Whitfield. Not on the residents who are starting to shift uncomfortably. Forward, the way she was trained to look when officers were yelling about casualties and protocol violations and the distinction between following orders and saving lives. Tuesday night, Whitfield continues, turning another page. This patient experienced cardiac arrest. His heart stopped. His oxygen saturation crashed. His code status was DNR, which means the appropriate response was observation and comfort measures. He looks up from the chart, and his eyes find Katie for the first time. Instead, the night nurse, he doesn't say her name, which is worse somehow, initiated a full code without consulting with me, without consulting with his cardiologist, without consulting with anyone. She performed aggressive chest compressions on a dying man with a sign "Do not resuscitate" order. One of the residents raises his hand. Whitfield doesn't acknowledge him. Wednesday morning, Whitfield says, his voice dropping lower, becoming somehow more dangerous, the same thing happened again. Code blue. Same nurse. Same aggressive intervention. Against orders. Against protocol. Against the explicit wishes documented in this chart. He holds up the document. Behind him, the projector shows the general's chest X-ray from postcode, the rib slightly fractured from compressions, the damage visible in grayscale. This patient suffered 2 separate cardiac arrests in 12 hours because he didn't receive the peaceful death he requested. Instead, he received trauma. Katie's hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. She is thinking about Marja. She is thinking about the weight of a 6-year-old beneath collapsed concrete. She is thinking about the difference between protocol and the moment when protocol becomes something that kills people instead of saving them. The third event, Whitfield says, and now he's circling, pacing like a predator who has caught something in a trap, occurred at 0315 this morning. Heart rate dropped to 42. Blood pressure 72/52. SpO2 84 and falling. The appropriate response, for a patient with a DNR order, would have been to notify the attending and allow the natural progression of his disease. He pauses. The silence in the room becomes something physical. Instead, the same nurse adjusted his vasopressor medication. Increased the norepinephrine drip from 0.05 to 0.14 micrograms per kilogram per minute. Manually stimulated the patient. Prevented the natural death he had explicitly requested. A female resident in the second row glances backward, trying to see Katie's face. Katie doesn't move. Nursing, Whitfield says, and his voice takes on a tone that could cut bone, exists within the medical hierarchy for a reason. Nurses implement physician orders. Nurses do not override physician orders based on personal judgment. Nurses do not play doctor. Nurses do not save patients when those patients have made clear they wish to die. He closes the chart. The sound echoes. This nurse did all 3 things. Multiple times. In direct violation of hospital policy, state medical board regulations, and the explicit written directives of her patient. He turns to face the room fully now, and his expression is the expression of a man who believes he has already won, who believes the architecture of power is so completely on his side that nothing could possibly threaten it. This is the consequence of allowing sentiment to override protocol. This is what happens when institutional boundaries are ignored. And this nurse will be receiving a formal written reprimand, a mandatory retraining program on DNR procedures and scope of practice, and will be reassigned effective immediately from ICU care. He pauses. He looks directly at Katie. I trust this is clear to everyone. The room goes so quiet you could hear the rain outside, could hear the ventilators humming from the hallway, could hear the electrical current running through the fluorescent lights overhead. 35 pairs of eyes are suddenly very interested in their laps, their clipboards, anything except the moment happening in front of them. One of the attending physicians opens his mouth. Closes it. Says nothing. Katie's lips don't move. Her face could be carved from stone. The tarnished challenge coin in her pocket, the one that old four-star general pressed into the palm of a young operative 20 years ago in a collapsed schoolhouse in Marja, pressing it into her hands while dust still coated her face and blood wasn't dry, that coin is the only thing in her body that feels like it's moving. Her thumb finds it. Her fingers close around it. And she stands completely still while Dr. Whitfield finishes destroying her career on the hospital board's behalf, while the institutional machinery that protects physicians and punishes nurses grinds forward with the inexorable logic of something that has never once been wrong, never once been challenged, never once faced anything that could actually threaten it. Questions? Whitfield asks. Nobody speaks. Then I think we're done here, he says. The laughter stopped her cold. By the vending machines on the third floor, two attendings in crisp white coats were bent together like they shared a secret, their voices low but not low enough. Katie's hand was already reaching for the coffee button when Dr. Patterson's voice cut through the mechanical whir of the machine, that wannabe hero nurse playing soldier. Did you hear her go on about Marja? Dr. Chen laughed, the sound sharp and bright in the fluorescent hallway. Probably thinks watching MASH reruns makes her qualified for combat medicine. She's going to get crucified at the next board meeting. Whitfield's already sharpening his knives. The coffee cup dropped into the metal tray with a hollow clink. Katie stood there for exactly 2 seconds, not trembling, not flushing red, not doing any of the things a person should do when they've just been publicly mocked by physicians who outranked her in every institutional way that mattered. She simply looked at the cup, then at the two doctors reflected in the glass machine door. Neither man noticed her. They were already walking away, shoulders still shaking with laughter, heading back toward the conference rooms where decisions got made and careers got decided. She paid 75 cents. Took the coffee. Walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Rain was hammering Seattle like applause, the kind of downpour that made the city look like it was underwater. Below, the parking garage gleamed with reflected light. A delivery truck sat idling near the ER entrance, exhaust mixing with the ozone smell of the storm. Katie pressed her palm against the cold window glass and did what she'd been trained to do in 17 classified operations across 4 theaters. She compartmentalized. The laughter went into one box. The threat went into another. The rage, the kind that came from being insulted by people who had no idea who they were actually mocking, that went into the deepest box of all, the one that didn't open until she was alone. The coffee was still steaming when she heard the footsteps behind her. Dr. Whitfield moved the way powerful people moved, like the air itself had to accommodate him. He carried a coffee cup in one hand and wore the satisfied expression of a man who'd just spent 90 minutes dismantling a subordinate in front of an audience of 30 residents. He positioned himself beside the window without actually looking at the view, which meant he was looking at her reflection. "Security will escort you out if you enter the general's room again," he said quietly. Almost gently. Like he was explaining something obvious to a confused child. Katie didn't turn around. She held the coffee cup with both hands, the steam rising into the cool air between them. Not trembling. Not flushing. Just listening, the way she'd listened to intel briefings in TOC trailers in places that didn't officially exist on any map. "I sit on the hospital board, Katie." His voice had that particular timbre of someone accustomed to obedience, smooth, measured, completely assured. "I control who stays employed here. I control who gets reported to the state licensing authority for practicing beyond their scope of practice. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She understood. Boards controlled credentials. State licensing authorities controlled licenses. And licenses were what separated a nurse from someone who lost everything: the job, the pension, the ability to work in healthcare anywhere in the country ever again. It was a threat served with perfect professionalism, which somehow made it worse. "The general is going to die," Whitfield continued. "His chart reads like a obituary. His organ systems are failing one by one. The cardiothoracic department has written him off. Accepting that reality is part of professional maturity. Clinging to false hope is emotional compromise, and emotional compromise is dangerous. So I'm going to tell you this once, you are reassigned effective immediately. You are not to enter that patient's room. You will not attempt to contact his family. You will not discuss his case with anyone. And you will certainly not countermand my directives again. The rain hammered harder against the window. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor was beeping in a rhythm that meant nothing good. Somewhere else, a family was probably learning words like comfort care and palliative and let him go. Katie turned the challenge coin over and over in her pocket. The metal was warm from her hand and tarnished almost black, the kind of coin that came from the kind of missions that didn't get written up in after-action reports. She could feel the edge worn smooth where it had been turned anxiously in thousands of moments exactly like this one, waiting, forced to wait, while other people made decisions about people who mattered. You have no idea who you're standing next to, she could have said. But that would have been pride talking, and pride was a luxury for people with something to lose. Instead, Katie simply pocketed the coin and turned back to her documentation. Whitfield waited for a response that didn't come. She could feel him expecting her to argue, plead, offer some desperate justification. When none came, he shifted his weight, just slightly, the movement of a powerful person encountering resistance that wouldn't yield to pressure. I'm glad we understand each other, he said finally, and his voice had changed, become slightly sharper. Not satisfied anymore. Something closer to frustration. He walked away before Katie could respond, his coffee cup in one hand, his authority in the other, and the kind of confidence that came from never having met anyone who wouldn't break under it. Katie stood at the window for another 5 minutes after he left, watching the rain fall and the city dissolve into mist below. Her reflection looked back at her from the glass, a woman in rumpled scrubs, dark circles under her eyes from double shifts, hair coming loose from a ponytail that had probably seen better days. Just a nurse, like the attendings had said. Just another healthcare worker trying to keep her head down and her license clean and her past so far buried that nobody could ever dig it up. The challenge coin pressed against her hip like a second heartbeat. At 2,100 hours, the charge nurse assigned Katie to pediatrics. The assignment came through the computer system with an efficiency that screamed of advanced coordination. Whitfield had already filed it, probably within 10 minutes of their conversation by the window. The pediatric unit was 3 floors down and about as far from the ICU as they could have moved her while keeping her in the same building. Katie didn't argue. She packed her stethoscope, her spare pens, the emergency shears she kept in her pocket, and the challenge coin. She was moving through the break room toward the elevator when she heard the voice behind her. You're the only one who hasn't given up on him. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway in dress blues, the uniform of someone used to command, used to rank, used to having people move when she moved. She was the general's daughter. Katie had seen her on the patient file during rounds, had watched her sit beside her father's bed with the rigid posture of military family who'd learned not to break in public. Her eyes were red-rimmed now, the careful control slipping just enough to show the person underneath. He keeps asking for someone named Reaper, Sarah continued, her voice breaking on the name. Over and over. Reaper, Reaper, Reaper. Like he's calling for someone who's supposed to come save him. Does that mean anything to you? Katie's hand froze on the coffee cup. The name hit like a round to the chest, the kind that didn't penetrate but left you gasping anyway. Reaper 6 had been her call sign in the 75th Ranger Regiment, back when she was a different person in a different body with a different name. That call sign had been buried deeper than the general's patient file, deeper than her fake resume, deeper than anything that should have been accessible to a delirious 70-year-old man whose brain was circling the drain from sepsis and organ failure. I don't know, Katie said, and the lie tasted like copper. I'm sorry. Sarah's face crumpled. She turned and walked away, shoulders hunched, moving like someone carrying weight that was becoming unbearable. Katie watched her go and felt something shift behind her ribs, the compartment she'd built with such care suddenly developing hairline fractures. The pediatric shift was 24 hours of machinery. Katie moved between rooms on autopilot, checking for drips and medication schedules, holding the hands of kids who were scared and parents who were terrified. Around 0100, she sat at the main workstation and brought up the ICU monitoring system from the nursing station computer, a violation of access protocols, technically, but nobody was watching and it took exactly 10 seconds. The general's pressures were dropping. The arterial line showed values trending toward shock, systolic creeping toward 70, diastolic at 40. His heart rate was climbing to compensate, 142, then 148, then 156. Atrial fibrillation starting to show on the monitor, the rhythm breaking apart like something trying to hold itself together against impossible odds. The notes from the day shift were sparse and clinical, comfort care approach discussed with family. DNR's DNI status confirmed. Morphine infusion titrated to effect. Katie checked the time. 0130 hours. The general had maybe 6 hours left, maybe less. His organs were failing in sequence now, shutting down one by one like a ship taking on water. The night charge nurse would be busy in the ER. There was a multi-vehicle collision on I-5, which meant all hands on deck, which meant skeleton crew coverage for the ICU, which meant one nurse managing a dozen patients who should have had 2 or 3. By 0230, Katie had changed out of her pediatric scrubs and was standing outside the ICU doors with her badge in hand. The night charge nurse was Ruth Costillanos, a woman in her 50s who'd served as an army medic in Desert Storm and still moved like someone used to making life-and-death decisions in conditions that didn't allow for hesitation. She saw Katie approaching and turned away without a word, busying herself with a chart. "I didn't see you," Ruth said quietly, not looking up. "But if I had, I'd tell you that Marcus called in sick tonight and his replacement is tied up on the code blue in the ER. The general's been alone for the last hour." Katie swiped her badge. The ICU doors slid open with a whisper. The general's room was lit by the glow of 3 monitors and the rain-reflected city lights beyond the window. His breathing was labored, each inhale a conscious effort, each exhale a sound like someone trying to speak through water. The monitors showed exactly what Katie had seen on the computer screen, now happening in real time, pressures dropping, heart rate erratic, oxygen saturation at 84% and falling. The 4-stand held a morphine drip and nothing else, nothing aggressive, nothing that violated the comfort care protocol or the DNR status that Whitfield had locked into place like a prison door. Katie locked the door behind her and silenced the alarms. The charge nurse found Katie at 2100, standing in the break room with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee that she hadn't touched in 30 minutes. Her name was Patricia, and she'd worked the night shift with Katie for 7 years, long enough to know that something was catastrophically wrong when Katie didn't respond to the first call. "Morrison. You're reassigned. Pediatrics, starting now." Dr. Whitfield's orders came down through administration an hour ago. Katie set the cup down without a word. She didn't ask why. She already knew. Whitfield had moved his strategic pieces across the board with surgical precision, remove the threat, isolate the patient, lock down the narrative. It wasn't a request. It was a controlled demolition of her access. Patricia lingered in the doorway, her voice dropping. "For what it's worth, I don't think that's right." Katie grabbed her bag from her locker, the motion fluid and economical, the same way she'd packed field kits in places where hesitation meant someone died. The pediatrics floor smelled like apple juice and crayons and the particular silence that only exists where small voices don't want to wake sleeping children. She walked past rooms with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceilings and Disney character murals that looked like they'd been painted by someone who'd never actually seen a Disney movie. The assignment was punishment disguised as hospital policy, and they both knew it. She was halfway through her first shift assessment when the woman found her in the medication room. Colonel Sarah Chen looked like she'd driven straight from the airport, a military uniform, pressed and perfect but still carrying the wrinkles of travel, boots polished to a mirror shine, and eyes that held the same steady composure Katie recognized from every commander she'd ever served under. She was the general's daughter, and she was looking at Katie like she knew exactly who Katie was. "Master Chief." It wasn't a question. Sarah Chen closed the medication room door behind her, and the temperature in the small space seemed to drop 15 degrees. Katie's hand stilled over the 4-drip she'd been checking. No one had called her that in 20 years. No one outside the classified files that supposedly didn't exist. Sarah's jaw was set the same way the general's had been when he pressed the challenge coin into Katie's palm in that rubble in Marja. My father is calling for Reaper. He's been calling for Reaper since they brought him in. Every time the morphine wears off, he says the name like it's a prayer. The nurses think he's confused. Dr. Whitfield thinks it's a sign he's dying. But you know who Reaper is, don't you? Katie's fingers tightened on the 4 bag. She could lie. She could deflect. She could pretend to be exactly what her fake resume said she was, a registered nurse with 9 years of civilian experience and nothing else, no call signs, no classified operations, no 6-year-old boy pulled from rubble whose spine would never be quite right again. But Sarah Chen was standing 3 feet away wearing colonel's rank and carrying the same weight in her eyes that Katie had carried for 2 decades, the weight of knowing that some people you save become the people you never stop saving. Colonel, your father is under a DNR order placed by Dr. Whitfield. I'm not allowed in his room. Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter, a sound like breaking glass. Not allowed. Do you understand what he's doing? He's not protecting my father, he's protecting himself. There's a reason Whitfield fought that hard to keep him coded, and it's not medical protocol. My father was investigating something. Something that connects to Whitfield. Before the MI, he was making calls, asking questions about pharmaceutical contracts, about kickbacks, about why certain drugs were being prescribed and others weren't. Katie's mind moved through the implications like a chess master reading the board 3 moves ahead. Whitfield had committed to the DNR not because the general was unsalvageable, Katie had already proven he wasn't, but because a dead 4-star general asks no more questions. A dead patient closes files. What's his status right now? Sarah's voice dropped, and the words came out like a soldier reporting a casualty count. Declining. Rapidly. The cardiologist says without aggressive intervention, pressors, inotropes, maybe an IABP balloon pump, he's got maybe 6 to 8 hours before his heart gives out completely. And Whitfield has made it very clear that comfort care is the only option. No escalation. No heroics. Just morphine and the slow fade. Katie understood the full geometry of her situation now. Whitfield had structured this perfectly. She was reassigned, removed from the case, no longer her responsibility. If she walked into the general's room and touched anything, if she adjusted a single drip or changed a single parameter, she would be the one violating protocol. She would be the one breaking the rules. She would be the one whose career ended not in a moment of heroic defiance but in a quiet disciplinary hearing where no one would ever know the truth. I can't access his room, Colonel. Whitfield made sure of that. He's locked down my credentials. Sarah stepped closer. My father told me something 20 years ago when I was 6. He said there was a person who pulled him out of a building when he thought he was going to die, and that person saved him when everyone else gave up. He said he didn't know her name, just knew her call sign, and he said if he ever got the chance, he'd spend the rest of his life making sure that person was never alone. Katie's breath steadied. She'd trained for this, not the words, but the moment. The moment when the past reached back and grabbed your collar and demanded a choice. There are other nurses on that floor. Other people with access. Sarah's eyes met hers, and Katie saw in that moment exactly who the general had raised, a soldier's daughter who understood what it meant to operate in the spaces that rules didn't cover. I know. And I think you have time to find one who might be willing to bend protocol if someone they respected asked them very carefully. The nurse's station is at 2200. My father's condition chart is at the foot of his bed. And sometimes, if a door doesn't have an alarm on it, it's easier to slip through after the charge nurse does her rounds. Sarah turned toward the door, then paused. He used to say your name in his sleep, you know. Even after they told him you were dead. Even after they said the operation was classified and buried and you didn't exist anymore. He never stopped saying it. Katie was alone in the medication room with her hands perfectly steady and her heart moving like it was trying to escape through her ribs. The pediatrics floor hummed with fluorescent light and the distant beeping of monitors from rooms full of children who would wake up tomorrow and be alive because someone had fought for them. She had 6 to 8 hours to decide if she was still willing to be the person who fought. The person who didn't follow the rules when rules meant watching someone die. The person the general had called Reaper when they were both buried in the dark and the only light was the possibility of survival. She pulled out the challenge coin from her pocket, tarnished silver, worn smooth from 20 years of turning it over in her fingers, and she walked toward the pediatric supply closet to find Margaret Chen, the night shift nurse who'd worked 3 summers in a field hospital in Kandahar before her visa expired, and who still kept a photograph of her unit on her break room locker where Whitfield never looked. The alarm screamed at 0300 like something alive and wounded. Katie heard them from pediatrics, 3 floors down, but loud enough to pierce through the soft beeping of monitors on sleeping children. She was checking vitals on a 4-year-old with pneumonia when the code announcement crackled through the intercom. Cardiac alert, ICU Bay 7. Cardiac alert, ICU Bay 7. Her hand stilled on the child's chest. Bay 7 was the general's room. She didn't run. Running meant attention. Running meant security would stop her at the stairwell. Instead, she finished the vitals with mechanical precision, respiration 22, oxygen saturation 94%, temperature holding, and she walked to the supply closet where Margaret Chen was restocking for kits. Margaret looked up, reading Katie's face the way only someone who'd worked field medicine could. The kind of reading that took 1 second and meant everything. "Go," Margaret said quietly. "I'll cover for you." Katie moved through the hospital corridors like water finding its path. She didn't take the main elevator, the one outside ICU had a camera, and Whitfield had made calls about that. She took the service stairwell, the one that smelled of industrial cleaner and something like diesel fuel, and she climbed fast but not fast enough to seem panicked. 2 flights. 3. The door to ICU was propped open by a crash cart someone had abandoned in the hallway, and she slipped through behind the chaos, her scrubs the same blue as everyone else's, her face turned away from the bay window where security might be watching. The code team filled the general's room like water filling a glass to breaking. 20 people maybe. Respiratory had the intubation kit spread across the bedside table. Cardiology was barking orders about epinephrine, about defibrillation pads, about getting a perfusionist down from cardiac surgery because something was very wrong with the electrical system of the man's heart. The monitors showed a rhythm that was less a heartbeat and more a tremor, atrial fibrillation, chaotic, the heart just vibrating in his chest instead of pumping, blood pooling instead of moving, and the oxygen saturation dropping, 88, 84, 79, 71. 30 seconds into the code, the resident called for CPR compressions. A trauma surgeon started pushing on the general's chest, hard rhythmic thrusts that lifted his ribs with each compression. The monitor didn't improve. The O2 sat climbed fractionally, 73, 74, then dropped again. 71. Katie stood in the doorway, watching. She'd seen this rhythm before. In Kandahar, in a field hospital that had no business staying open, treating injuries that had no business being survived. She knew what happened next if they kept doing compressions on a heart that wasn't failing from electrical chaos but from mechanical failure, a blockage somewhere in the arterial tree, a clot, something solid that was choking the blood supply and making the organ itself turn against its own survival. 10 minutes of this and the tissue would start to necrotize. 20 minutes and death would become permanent, not a state they could reverse. The resident was still calling compressions. The nurse was still pushing medication. Nobody was thinking. "Open him," Katie said. The room stopped. Every face turned. The resident, a tall man with sweat already on his forehead, stared at the voice from the doorway. "I'm sorry, who?" "Open his chest. Now." Katie was already moving, peeling gloves from the box on the counter, grabbing the procedure tray that no one had prepared because thoracotomy was something cardiothoracic did in surgery, not something you did in an ICU bay with a scalpel and hope. "He's got a mechanical blockage. Compressions aren't moving blood through a thrombotic system. Every second you wait is 20 seconds of organ death." "That's not protocol," someone said. A nurse, maybe. Or maybe Whitfield, who'd appeared in the doorway behind Katie like he'd been drawn by the sound of her voice. We need surgical clearance for that kind of. Katie grabbed the scalpel. Not the surgical kit, just the blade, the handle, the thing in her hands that weighed less than a pen but carried the weight of 20 years of decisions made in rooms where protocol was a luxury and people bled faster than rules could save them. She laid out the field on the general's chest with one hand while her other hand found the landmark she'd memorized 20 years ago, the fifth intercostal space, the anterior axillary line, the place where a person's ribs made a map that was always the same. "Stop CPR," she said. "Absolutely not," the resident started. Katie pressed the blade down. The skin parted. Subcutaneous tissue opened like a door, and blood welled up in a thin dark line. She worked the blade deeper with the precision of someone who'd done this in a tent during mortar fire, muscle memory so deep it lived in her bones, not her mind. She opened the intercostal space with 2 fingers, spreading the ribs, and she opened the pericardium, that smooth silvery sac around the heart, and then she had her hand inside the chest cavity, the general's heart beating against her palm. Barely beating. Barely alive. She felt it under her fingers the way a different kind of person might feel a pulse, not with instruments but with the direct language that a heart spoke only to hands that had held other hearts in other wars. The blockage was there, at the left anterior descending coronary artery, a clot the size of a fingernail that was choking the tissue it should have fed. Katie began manual cardiac massage. Her fingers moved in the rhythm she'd learned from men who didn't survive to teach anyone else, the rhythm that came from somewhere deeper than training. She squeezed the heart in her closed fist, pumping blood forward by sheer will and precision, feeling the ventricles collapse and refill under the pressure of her hand. O2 sat climbed, 76, 79, 82, 85. The monitor shifted, still chaotic, still wrong, but less desperate. The tissue was getting perfusion. The organ had time to remember how to beat on its own. Epinephrine, 1 milligram 4, Katie said, and someone, the resident, finally understanding, administered it. She felt the electrical shock ripple through the heart in her hand. The rhythm shifted. The monitor's frantic line organized itself, a blip, a pause, another blip. The beginning of something like a pattern. Again, Katie said. 2 more rounds of epinephrine. 2 more minutes of her hand moving in the rhythm, the general's ribs spreading under her forearm, his heart learning to beat as she beat it, blood flowing where it had stopped. The monitor continued its recovery, still tachycardic at 142 beats per minute, still angry, but alive. The O2 sat climbed to 91. Stable. The perfusion pressure climbed. The tissue got its blood back. Katie released her hand slowly, feeling the heart take the rhythm away from her fingers and keep it. It held. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats. The monitor showed sinus rhythm, real rhythm, not electrical chaos, the pattern of a heart remembering how to save itself. Close the pericardium with absorbable suture, she said quietly. Get him to surgery for proper repair, but he's stable. He's perfused. He's alive. The cardiothoracic resident who'd rushed in from the call bell, a woman in her 50s with the kind of face that had seen this kind of emergency 500 times, stepped forward and took over, her hands already moving with the competence of someone trained. You, she said, looking at Katie, stay. Walk me through what you felt. But Whitfield had already moved. Katie saw him in her peripheral vision, one hand on his phone, his other hand raised in a gesture that was both furious and calculated. He stepped into the hallway and she heard him say 3 words, administration. Now. The cardiothoracic surgeon was stitching the pericardium, her movements economical, sure. The monitors continued their steady beeping. The general's chest rose and fell with the ventilator, his vitals holding, his oxygen saturation steady at 93%. For the first time in 3 weeks, for the first time since they'd admitted him to Seattle General with a diagnosis of systemic failure that was supposed to be terminal, his heart was not failing. He was alive. Because Katie Morrison had done what no protocol would allow and no administrator would ever sanction. The first sign of the punishment came at 04:45 when Rodriguez from security approached her outside the locker room. His face was different than it had been during shift handoff. Not angry, worse. He looked like someone had ordered him to do something that cost him respect. "I need your badge," he said quietly. "Your access is deactivated as of right now." Katie didn't argue. She pulled the badge from her lanyard, the thing that had been her identity for a decade, her proof of belonging in this place, and she laid it in his palm. The weight of it seemed to matter as it transferred. Rodriguez looked at the badge like it might burn him, then pocketed it without meeting her eyes. By 0600, she'd been called to human resources. The office was on the 3rd floor, all soft carpet and the kind of lighting designed to make people confess. The HR director sat behind a desk with a folder in front of her that was easily 3 inches thick. Incident reports. Policy violations. Photographs of Katie in the ICU bay, her hand in the general's chest. Hospital legal had already photographed the scene, already documented the violation. "You performed a procedure for which you have no licensure," the HR director said. Her voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You overrode the attending physician's direct orders. You initiated a thoracotomy without surgical authorization. Do you understand the liability exposure you've created?" Katie didn't answer. The truth of the situation sat like a stone in her chest. She could explain. She could detail the medical necessity, the deteriorating vitals, the blocked coronary artery. She could make the case with the precision of someone who'd been trained in both medicine and tactics, and she might even win. The general was alive. The cardiac surgeon had confirmed that Katie's manual massage had saved his life, had given tissue enough perfusion to stay viable long enough for surgical repair. But winning would require revealing why she knew how to do what she'd done. It would require opening the file that had been sealed, discussing the call sign that didn't exist, explaining the 20 years of training that no civilian nurse should have. It would require speaking the truth, and the truth belonged to a person who no longer had any right to be Katie Morrison. "I understand," she said instead. They took her badge. They walked her through the hospital with security, both of them silent, toward the employee parking garage. They documented every step. By 07:15, 2 security guards were in her locker with an inventory sheet, photographing her belongings like they were evidence. Her stethoscope. Her extra pair of shoes. The photograph of Margaret Chen's unit in Kandahar that she'd kept taped inside the metal door. They took everything. Katie sat in the administrative office and watched through the window as they finished. Whitfield was there, speaking to the hospital's legal counsel, gesturing to documents with the kind of precision that suggested he'd done this before, that he'd erased people systematically, professionally, without hesitation. She walked to her car without being escorted the second time. The parking garage smelled like oil and exhaust, the concrete floor cold under her shoes. Her decade-old Honda was in spot CR47, the same spot she'd parked in for 4 years. She unlocked it and sat in the driver's seat without turning the key. The steering wheel felt like something from another life, the life where she'd been Katie Morrison, ICU nurse, the woman who showed up and helped people and was trusted to be in the room when they were dying. That woman was gone now. Rain started hitting the windshield at 0730, soft at first, then harder. Katie didn't turn on the wipers. She sat in the dark with the water streaming down the glass and her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, and she turned the challenge coin over in her palm. The tarnished silver was warm from her hand. The inscription was worn smooth from 20 years of this same motion, Reaper 6. Marja. You carried me out. She'd carried him out of rubble when he was 6 years old. She'd held his spine together and kept him alive and refused to leave him. And 20 years later, she'd done it again, squeezed his heart in her hands and forced it to keep beating when everyone else had decided he was finished, that some lives weren't worth the effort, that protocol mattered more than survival. Her phone rang at 0745. The state licensing board. She didn't answer. It rang again at 0800. And again at 0830. The messages stacked up like stones. Investigation initiated. your license pending review, statement required within 72 hours, recommended legal counsel. There were no messages from anyone at Seattle General. Not from Margaret, who'd risked her own job covering for Katie's absence. Not from the general. Not from the cardiothoracic surgeon who'd finished the repair and probably saved his life permanently when Katie's hands had given up the work. Just the silence of the hospital closing its doors. The silence of a place that had decided she'd never existed, that the woman who'd pulled the general back from death was a violation so severe that even gratitude couldn't excuse it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 11:30 when Katie's phone buzzed with a news alert: local nurse suspended for unlicensed medical procedure on cardiac patient. Hospital investigating potential state licensure violations. Whitfield had gone to the media. He'd turned the story into something public, something that couldn't be quietly resolved. He'd made sure that Katie Morrison, the ghost nurse, the woman with no past and no future, would be permanently unable to work anywhere in healthcare again. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and held the challenge coin so tight it left an impression in her palm. The rain hammered the windshield like something desperate trying to get in. She had nowhere left to go. The 2 hours crawled like infected tissue. Forehead pressed against the steering wheel, Katie didn't move. Her decade-old Honda sat in the garage on level 3, engine off, the rain outside turning the windshield into a watercolor of distorted light. She could see the hospital entrance from here, the pneumatic doors sliding open and closed, the way they had for 8 years while she pushed the name Katie Morrison through those doors like a costume she wore before taking it off. No identity to return to. That was the knife's edge of it. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison didn't exist on paper. She existed in 17 redacted files in a Pentagon basement, in unit patches she couldn't sew onto civilian clothes, in muscle memory that belonged to someone with a number instead of a name. The fake resume was gone now. Security had emptied her locker while she watched from the hallway, her civilian clothes folded into a cardboard box, her old nursing textbooks stacked like evidence. One of them opened to a page she'd annotated in 2008, when she was learning to be invisible. The challenge coin was still in her pocket. Worn smooth from 20 years of turning it over between her fingers in dark rooms. 17 operations. For theaters. One 6-year-old boy pulled from rubble with shrapnel taking out 3 vertebrae. She pressed her thumb against the coin's edge and felt the tiny groove where shrapnel had grazed it in that same explosion. The boy had handed it to her afterward, when someone had finally pulled the concrete off him and carried him to the medical tent. His small hand had shoved the coin at her with a clarity that came from shock. "Don't lose this," he'd said. She hadn't. The fluorescent garage light above the car hummed like a trapped wasp. Rain drummed the roof. There was nowhere left to go because all the exits led backward. If she started the car, she could drive to the VA. She could sit in some administrator's office and tell them the truth about who she was, and they would verify it with a single phone call to SOCOM, and then the civilian world would know that Seattle General had just fired a Master Chief Petty Officer for doing exactly what her training had programmed into her for 20 years, saving the patient when everyone else was ready to let him die. Or she could sit here until security found her car and called a tow truck. She stayed for 2 hours and 7 minutes. Then she turned the key. The next sound Katie heard was the helicopter. It wasn't a sound that belonged to Seattle in the morning, rotor wash that shook windows, that made birds scatter from the hospital's roofline like shrapnel. She'd been 3 blocks away when she heard it, just pulling onto the street that led away from the medical center. The sound made her hands tighten on the wheel. Made something in her chest recognize the acoustic signature of a UH-60M Black Hawk before her civilian mind could catch up. By the time she'd turned around in a parking lot and driven back, the helicopter was already gone. But she knew exactly where it had landed. The rooftop helipad of Seattle General. She sat in her car in the parking garage and listened to the hospital radio crackling in her apartment, old habits, a scanner frequency she'd monitored since 2012, and heard the administrative codes that meant military liaison at the front desk, security protocol upgrade, boardroom access granted. She should have left. She should have driven out of the garage and kept driving until Seattle General was a town she used to live in. Instead, she was still there when 4 sailors in dress uniforms walked through the emergency department entrance at 1,415 hours, their movements synchronized in a way that civilian feet never moved, their bearing the particular silence of men trained to walk into rooms that belonged to other people. The hospital security guard was a Marine. She'd spoken to him exactly twice in 8 years, both times brief and professional. His name was Rodriguez. When the sailors approached his desk, his spine straightened. His hand came up in a salute before he could stop himself. The movement was involuntary. Pure muscle memory recognizing something his civilian job didn't have language for. "We need to speak with Reaper 6, one of them said. Not asked. Rodriguez's face went the color of old bone. Katie was in the parking garage 3 levels below when her phone, not her hospital phone, the one they'd already deactivated, but the personal phone that hadn't rung in 8 years except for a single wrong number in 2019, when that phone vibrated against her thigh. No caller ID. Just a string of numbers. She stared at it for 6 seconds. Then she answered. Reaper 6. A voice like a tank engine. We're inbound at 14:30. Stay visible. The line went dead. 23 minutes later, Katie Morrison walked into Seattle General through the same emergency department doors the sailors had used. She'd changed into clean scrubs. Had pinned her badge back on, even though it wouldn't work anymore, even though she was technically trespassing. The badge was muscle memory too. The way a skin you shed keeps its shape for a little while after you're gone. She walked past the security desk. Rodriguez didn't meet her eyes. She walked up the service stairs, the ones the residents used, the ones that didn't have cameras, and at the 3rd floor, she stepped out into the administrative corridor. The boardroom was at the end of the hallway. Mahogany doors that probably cost more than her car. Through the small rectangular window, she could see them. The 4 sailors standing at attention. And in the center of the table, the general. Awake. For the first time in 4 weeks, his eyes were open and tracking movement. Colonel Sarah Chen was there too, her hand on the back of his wheelchair. Katie didn't enter. She stood in the hallway with her hands in her pockets, fingers finding the challenge coin, and watched through the 5-inch window as a Navy captain opened a manila folder. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, the captain read aloud. Silver Star. He paused. Katie could see the other officers' faces shift. 3 bronze stars. Another pause. The captain's voice dropped into the formal register reserved for things that mattered. Navy Cross. 17 classified operations across 4 theaters of active conflict. Silence. The kind that lives in rooms where people are reckoning with something they didn't expect. Then the general spoke. His voice was hoarse, the voice of a man who hadn't used words in weeks, but his words came out steady. She pulled me out of Marja when I was 6 years old. He stopped. Breathed. Shrapnel took out her lumbar spine. L2 through L5. She spent 8 months in Walter Reed. The doctors told her she'd never serve again. Another pause. She refused a medical discharge until her entire team was home. The words hung there. Katie felt something in her chest that might have been muscle memory recognizing its own echo. I spent the last 20 years, the general continued, waiting to find her again to say thank you. Then she was here. In this hospital. Pushing me back from the edge of a cliff I decided to jump off. And the first time she did it, the first time she made a decision that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with survival, she lost everything for it. The captain closed the folder. He looked directly at the open boardroom door where Katie was standing, though his head didn't turn. Somehow he knew. Somehow they all knew. The 4 sailors turned, as if moved by a single command. They stood at ease, and in that stance was something that Katie hadn't felt in 20 years. She was standing in front of her own people. Master Chief, the captain said. You're released from civilian restrictions effective immediately. Your service record has been restored to active status. Pending your approval, we have orders for you. Katie didn't cross the threshold. She just nodded once, and that was enough. What happened next unfolded like those 17 operations, compartmentalized, clean, without mercy. 72 hours later, Katie was working a quiet shift in post-op when the FBI agents walked into Seattle General with a warrant. She didn't watch. She was adjusting a level 1 rapid infuser, her movements precise and practiced, when the nurses' station erupted into the kind of hushed excitement that precedes professional catastrophe. The break room television showed CNN federal agents walking out of the hospital administrative office with bankers' boxes. One of them was labeled Research Department, Dr. Whitfield. The audit had started the moment the Navy captain mentioned Katie's real name to hospital administration. It didn't take federal investigators long to find the pattern: Dr. Whitfield's pharmaceutical kickbacks dating back 2,347 days. His attempt to forge Katie's personnel file, a document so carefully edited that it should have been invisible to anyone without federal database access, but which became catastrophically visible once someone knew to look for it. His patient care decisions influenced by drug company payments. His research data falsified in ways that hurt 14 families whose loved ones had received compromised care based on his recommendations. His medical license suspended within 8 days. His attorney negotiating plea terms by day 10. By day 21, federal agents had arrested Dr. Whitfield in his office as he was pulling files from his desk drawer, documents he probably thought would help his case, but which instead became evidence of obstruction. He was convicted on 7 counts. 30 months in federal prison. The hospital settled the class action lawsuit from the families. Dr. Whitfield's name was removed from the research wing. The residents who'd laughed during grand rounds were reassigned. Dr. Patterson faced his own board review for the vending machine comments, a formal reprimand and mandatory bias training that Katie heard he attended while visibly furious. Katie refused every interview, every apology, every settlement offer. She requested only one thing: reinstatement with full back pay. The hospital board agreed within hours. She worked her shift. She saved lives with the same quiet precision she'd used in 4 theaters of active conflict. She wore her badge. She didn't speak about what had happened, and in that silence, it became mythic. The story spread through Seattle General like infection control, spreading awareness: the nurse who'd been erased, the nurse who'd saved the 4-star general when everyone else was ready to let him die, the nurse who'd turned out to be someone the Navy had sent a Black Hawk to retrieve. By month 3, Katie was the most respected person in the ICU. By month 5, the hospital president had stopped trying to schedule meetings with her. By month 6, a letter arrived from the VA asking if she wanted her service record officially restored to civilian access. She declined politely. Some things were better left in the dark. It was 6 months to the day that Katie stood on a naval base podium in San Diego, the Pacific bright behind her, 200 sailors in formation at parade rest. The general was beside her in his dress uniform, all 4 stars catching the sunlight like permission. His hands were steady when he reached for her medal, the retirement ceremony she'd never gotten 20 years ago, the one they were giving her now in front of people who would carry the story forward. Master Chief Morrison taught me, the general said, his voice carrying across the parade ground, that rank is what they give you, but character is what you give back. The pin went through the medal ribbon. It was done cleanly this time. No humiliation. No audience full of people who doubted her. Just ceremony, just recognition, just the general's hand gripping her shoulder afterward and squeezing once with the pressure of 20 years of gratitude. Katie's response was brief, because that was who she was. Efficiency of language married to precision of meaning. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching, she said, and she saluted. The formation saluted back, 200 sailors standing in unified recognition of something they understood in their bones. Later, at the reception in the officers' club, Colonel Sarah Chen found her by the window overlooking the bay. "You knew him in Marja," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Katie nodded. "I knew a brave kid who didn't cry even when he should have." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the challenge coin. It was polished now, the wear marks buffed smooth, but the groove where shrapnel had grazed it was still visible. "He gave me this in the rubble. I've carried it for 20 years. Sarah took the coin and turned it over in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. Thank you, she said simply, for bringing him home twice. That night, Katie drove back to Seattle General for her shift. Her badge was clipped to her scrubs. The limp from the major shrapnel damage was a little more pronounced after the long ceremony, but it was there the way old wounds always are, not hidden, just accepted. She parked in the garage on level 3, the same level where she'd sat for 2 hours and 7 minutes waiting to see if there was anywhere left to go. Now she knew. There was always somewhere to go, as long as there were people who needed saving. She was just a nurse. Exactly what she'd always wanted to be. If you love a good underdog story, hit that like button now. Subscribe so you never miss one. And comment below, have you ever been the underdog? Let's see how this plays out.